Have you ever wondered why, despite having everything you thought you needed, the job, the house, the relationship, the phone that unlocks with your face, there's still this quiet ache inside you, a restlessness you can't explain, a kind of emptiness that gnaws at you when the world finally falls silent at night? It's strange, isn't it? We chase so many things in life. We climb ladders, collect followers, measure ourselves against others, and yet, even when we win, it never feels like enough. There's always something missing, something left unfulfilled. And maybe you've told yourself the same story we've all been told. If I just get that next thing, I'll finally be happy. But it never works. So what's really happening here? Why is it that so many of us, living in a world of abundance and instant gratification, still wake up feeling anxious, dissatisfied, and a little lost? The Buddha answered this question over 2,500 years ago, and his answer wasn't wrapped in mystical riddles or flowery language. It was brutally simple. He said, "Suffering doesn't come from the outside, it arises from within. Within our own hearts, there live three invisible forces. They're not strangers. In fact, they're so close, so familiar that we often don't even recognize them for what they are. And yet, they are the roots of every sorrow, every anxiety, every outburst of anger, every hollow victory, and every sleepless night. These three silent enemies are known as greed, hatred, and delusion, or as the ancient texts call them, labha, dosa, and moha. And no matter who you are, rich or poor, young or old, believer or skeptic, they live in you, just as they live in me. And left unchecked, they quietly dictate the course of your entire life. Now you might be thinking, greed, hatred, delusion, come on, I'm not that bad. But these aren't always the monstrous feelings we picture in morality tales. They often wear subtle disguises. They sneak in through the smallest desires, the tiniest grudges, the quiet assumptions we make about ourselves and others. Greed isn't just about hoarding money or chasing power. It's that nagging voice telling you to refresh your feed for more likes. It's that restless craving for validation, for attention, for one more thing to fill the silence inside. Hatred isn't only violent outbursts or public rage. It's that flash of irritation when someone cuts you off in traffic. It's the cold distance you build between yourself and those who don't agree with you. It's the silent resentment you carry like a stone in your chest. And delusion. Delusion is perhaps the most dangerous of all, because it blinds us to the very forces that govern our lives. It's the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what the world owes us. It's mistaking temporary things for permanent security. It's chasing happiness in places where it was never meant to be found. These three are the architects of suffering, and they don't care whether you believe in them or not. They work quietly, shaping your emotions, your relationships, your ambitions, and your disappointments. And the terrifying part is, we've spent so long living under their influence, we often mistake them for our own true nature. But it doesn't have to stay this way. The Buddha wasn't interested in empty philosophy. He taught a path, a way to see these enemies clearly and to free ourselves from their grip, not by rejecting the world, but by understanding how our own minds create it. And here's the good news. Once you see them for what they are, they lose their power. A mind aware of its own greed can choose generosity. A heart that recognizes hatred can cultivate compassion. And a person brave enough to confront their own delusions begins, for the first time, to taste freedom. This isn't about becoming a monk or escaping to a mountain cave. It's about learning to live awake here in the messy, complicated world we all share. Because if there's one thing we all have in common, it's this: we want to be happy. We want to suffer less. And whether we realize it or not, everything we do is driven by this silent, persistent hope. But chasing happiness without understanding the enemies within is like trying to row a boat with a hole in the bottom. No matter how fast you paddle, you'll keep sinking. Over the next chapters, we're going to shine a light into the darkest corners of the mind. We'll uncover how greed whispers false promises, how hatred poisons our hearts, and how delusion keeps us running in circles. And more importantly, how you can begin to uproot them one by one. This is the beginning of a journey inward, a journey toward clarity, toward peace, and toward a kind of freedom no one can give you and no one can take away. Because the greatest battle you'll ever fight isn't out there, it's in here. And the enemies you'll face aren't strangers. They've been with you your whole life. But here's the secret: you are not your greed. You are not your hatred. You are not your delusion. You are the awareness watching them. And awareness, once it awakens, can no longer be enslaved. Let's begin. There's a peculiar thing about desire. The more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. At first, it seems harmless. A passing want, a harmless indulgence, a simple why not. But before you know it, what once felt like a small craving has turned into an obsession. And soon, you're chasing things not because you truly need them, but because the absence of them feels unbearable. Greed in its purest form isn't just about money or possessions. It's a hunger for more attention, more approval, more experiences, more certainty. It's that voice in your head that whispers, "If only I had that, then I'd be happy." And for a brief, fleeting moment, you might be. The new phone in your hand, the compliments after a promotion, the spark of excitement when someone finally notices you. But it never lasts, because desire doesn't know how to stop. It doesn't understand enough. It's like drinking salt water in the middle of the ocean. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. And here's the cruel part: modern life is designed to keep you thirsty. Everything around you, ads, algorithms, endless scrolling, is built to convince you that happiness lies just one click, one purchase, one achievement away. We're told to hustle, to upgrade, to collect experiences like souvenirs. And if you stop to ask yourself why, the answer usually comes back empty. The Buddha described greed as one of the three poisons because it poisons the mind with restlessness. It keeps you chasing shadows, always believing that fulfillment lies just beyond the next hill. But every time you arrive, the horizon moves. And it doesn't stop at material things. Greed seeps into relationships too. It's in the partner who isn't quite enough, the friend who doesn't text back fast enough, the constant comparing of your life against the highlight reels of others. It turns people into products, interactions into transactions. You start to measure love by how much it gives you. You measure success by how envious others are of you. And even spirituality becomes another thing to collect, a tool for bragging rights, rather than inner peace. But what's so dangerous about greed isn't just that it makes you restless, it makes you blind. You become so fixated on what you lack, you stop noticing what you have. Moments slip away. Connections weaken. The simple, quiet beauty of ordinary days becomes invisible, drowned out by the roar of wanting more. And all the while, the mind insists. Just one more. One more thing, one more person, one more achievement, then you'll be at peace. But you never are. There's an old Buddhist parable about a man who discovers a magical gem. Whenever he wishes for something while holding it, his wish comes true. At first, he asks for wealth, then a beautiful home, then power, then influence. And with every wish granted, he feels emptier until one day, sitting alone in his palace, surrounded by everything he ever wanted, he makes one final wish: take it all away. Because even if you fill your hands with the world, the heart remains empty. The question then isn't whether you desire things. To be human is to want. The real question is whether you are ruled by your desires. Are you chasing things that nourish you, Or are you feeding a hunger that can never be satisfied? And here's where wisdom enters. The Buddha never condemned desire itself. It's natural to want comfort, connection, even beauty. But he warned against attachment to craving, the endless cycle of believing your happiness depends on acquiring more. It's not desire that causes suffering. It's being enslaved by it. And the antidote to greed isn't deprivation. It's contentment, the quiet art of appreciating what already is, of knowing how to savor enough. It's not about renouncing everything and moving to a monastery. It's about learning to notice when you're caught in the grip of endless wanting and choosing, in that moment to let go, to breathe, to see that perhaps right here in this unremarkable moment, nothing is missing. You don't need the perfect relationship to feel loved. You don't need the next promotion to feel worthy. You don't need to outrun others to be at peace. Greed says, more, more, more. Wisdom replies, enough. And in that quiet enoughness, something strange happens. Your vision clears. Life slows down. And what once felt ordinary, a cup of tea, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, a laugh with a friend, reveals itself as extraordinary. Not because you finally acquired everything, but because you realized you already had it. The journey away from greed isn't a sprint. It's a practice. A daily returning to simplicity, to gratitude, to presence. And every time you choose appreciation over craving, you reclaim a little more freedom. Because the world will always tempt you. It will promise happiness in every package, every like, every accomplishment. And it will never stop. But you can choose to stop chasing. You can choose to notice. And in that noticing, you begin to remember what peace feels like. As we move forward, it's important to realize that greed rarely works alone. It has two companions. One stirs the fire of resentment when it doesn't get what it wants. The other clouds your judgment, making you believe every craving deserves to be obeyed. And so, our next step is to meet the second of these ancient poisons. A force that turns disappointment into anger and unmet desires into bitterness. It's time to face hatred, the fire that burns everything it touches. There's a fire that doesn't need wood to burn. It doesn't leave ashes, but it scorches everything it touches. It starts small, a flicker of irritation, a spark of frustration, but if left unchecked, it can consume an entire life. This fire is called hatred. Unlike greed, which seduces with promises, hatred thrives in the shadows of disappointment. It waits for the moment when things don't go your way, when someone offends you, when a plan collapses, or when life refuses to bend to your will. And in that gap between expectation and reality, anger rises. Sometimes it's sharp and explosive, a harsh word, a slammed door, a clenched fist. Other times it's quiet, seething beneath the surface. A grudge you can't quite let go. A resentment you feed in silence. A bitterness that turns the heart hard and cold. The Buddha described hatred as the second of the three poisons because it blinds us to our humanity. It distorts perception, turning people into enemies and differences into threats. It tells you the world would be better if certain people disappeared or certain memories could be erased. But here's what hatred never tells you. It burns the one who holds it. There's an ancient teaching. Holding onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. And yet, how often do we do this? How often do we replay old insults in our heads, keeping them alive like coals smoldering in our chest? How often do we fantasize about revenge, or imagine the satisfaction of proving someone wrong? Modern life, with its relentless pace and constant provocations, offers endless opportunities to be angry. A rude driver, an unfair comment, a betrayal by someone you trusted. The news alone can keep you in a state of permanent outrage. and the culture often rewards it. We're told to clap back, to cut out toxic people, to never forgive. Anger is framed as strength, as self-respect, as proof you won't be walked over. But is it strength, or is it just another chain? The truth is, hatred consumes far more of you than it does of anyone else. It narrows your world. It hardens your heart, and it feeds on your peace. What makes anger so dangerous is its ability to disguise itself. It often wears the mask of righteousness. I'm angry because I care. I'm furious because it's unfair. And sometimes it's true. Anger can illuminate injustice. It can be a natural reaction to harm. But wisdom teaches us that while anger might visit, it should never be allowed to stay. Why? Because anger clouds the mind. In its heat, you stop seeing clearly. The person who wronged you stops being a human being and becomes a villain. Your own mistakes get hidden behind justifications. And worst of all, your capacity for compassion begins to wither. There's a simple but powerful Buddhist reflection. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal law. That doesn't mean you allow yourself to be mistreated. It means you respond without poisoning your own spirit. It's not about pretending you're not hurt. It's about choosing not to live in that hurt. And this isn't easy. When anger flares, it's intoxicating. It feels like power. It gives you the illusion of control. But it's an illusion because it controls you. There's a story of a monk who was insulted daily by a cruel man in his village. Day after day, the man would shout insults as the monk passed by, trying to provoke a reaction. But the monk remained calm, never responding in kind. One day the man, frustrated, asked, "Why don't you ever fight back?" And the monk replied, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse to take it, to whom does it belong?" Anger is a gift you don't have to accept. And this doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become wise. You choose your battles. You recognize when anger serves a purpose and when it's just a fire burning down your inner house. Hatred shrinks your world. It isolates you. It convinces you that you are separate, alone, and surrounded by threats. But compassion does the opposite. It expands your world. It reminds you that others suffer too. That behind every cruel act is a tangled web of pain, ignorance, and fear. This doesn't excuse harm, but it explains it. And when you understand, you loosen the grip of anger. You realize you don't have to carry it. And here's the quiet truth. When you let go of hatred, it's not the other person who is freed. It's you. The absence of that fire reveals a kind of peace you forgot existed. Not the shallow peace of getting your way, but the deep, steady calm of no longer being ruled by your reactions. This is why the practice of metta, loving kindness, was so central in the Buddha's teachings. It's not about being naive or soft. It's about strength. The kind of strength that refuses to let anger dictate your life. You don't need to approve of someone to wish them well. You don't need to like them to stop hating them. You need only to remember, everyone you meet is fighting battles you cannot see. And sometimes, those battles turn them cruel, selfish, or unkind. But if you let their darkness make you bitter, you become what you despise. Hatred says, burn it all down. Wisdom says, put the fire out. And so, the journey continues. Because after greed's endless hunger and hatred's scorching fire, there remains one more poison. One that clouds the mind, blurs truth, and keeps you trapped in illusions. It's subtle, slippery, and perhaps the most dangerous of them all. It's time to meet delusion, the fog that blinds the soul. There's a kind of suffering that's harder to notice because it doesn't scream. It doesn't burst into flames like anger. It doesn't hunger endlessly like greed. It's quieter, subtler, and far more dangerous. It's the fog that makes you mistake the unreal for the real. It's the veil that keeps you chasing shadows. It's called delusion. In the ancient texts, The Buddha spoke of delusion as the most insidious of the three poisons. Because while greed and hatred are easy to recognize once they surface, delusion seeps into your thinking without a sound. It hides behind your assumptions. It lurks within your certainties. It colors the lens through which you see the world. And that's precisely what makes it so destructive. You see, most people aren't suffering because of what's happening in their lives. They suffer because of how they perceive what's happening. A setback isn't just a setback, it becomes a personal failure. A stranger's indifference isn't just a moment, it turns into proof you're unlovable. A fleeting feeling isn't just an emotion, it becomes your identity. Delusion convinces you that your thoughts are facts, your emotions are truth, and your opinions are reality. And so you live in a house of mirrors, reacting not to the world as it is, but to your distorted reflection of it. There's an old Zen saying, when the mind is clouded, even the brightest light looks dim. How often have you chased things you thought would bring you happiness, only to feel empty once you had them? How many times have you clung to stories about yourself? I'm not good enough. I always fail. People can't be trusted. And without ever questioning whether those stories were true, delusion feeds on your unquestioned beliefs. It whispers, "This is just the way things are." It convinces you that your fears are reasonable, your limitations are fixed, and that you already know all you need to know. And it thrives in distraction. In a world of constant noise, endless scrolling, breaking news, artificial connections, there's little space left for clarity. Delusion loves this. It wants you busy, overstimulated, reacting, and too exhausted to reflect. Because when you're constantly occupied, you don't have time to ask the most important question. Is this real? Is this anxiety about the future based on fact or imagination? Is this resentment toward a person based on who they are or who you believe them to be? Is this fear of failure rooted in reality or in an old wound you never healed? Delusion is the veil that makes you believe you're awake while you're still dreaming. And this is why in Buddhist practice, clarity is sacred. The path isn't about adding new beliefs, but about stripping away illusions. It's about seeing clearly, seeing things as they truly are, not as your mind has painted them. The Buddha called this right view, the ability to perceive life without the distortion of attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And it begins, not with grand philosophies, but with simple, direct awareness. To notice when you're lost in thought, to recognize when a judgment arises, to catch yourself believing a story your mind is telling. Like when you hear yourself thinking, "I'm worthless," and instead of believing it, you pause and say, "A thought has appeared." Or when anger surges in your chest, and instead of unleashing it, you observe, "This is anger, hot, sharp, rising." You start to see thoughts and emotions not as facts, but as passing weather. Some days are cloudy, some days are stormy, some days are clear, but none of them define the sky. And here's the most liberating truth: you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. When you realize this, not just intellectually but viscerally, through experience, a kind of quiet freedom dawns. You stop clinging so tightly to pleasure. You stop resisting pain so violently. You stop believing every story your mind spins. And in that space, peace. Not the peace of perfect circumstances, but the peace of a mind no longer enslaved by its own illusions. Delusion would have you believe you need to control the world to be at ease. But wisdom reveals that you only need to see the world clearly, to notice the impermanence in all things, to recognize the unsatisfactory nature of clinging, to see that what you call a self is a constantly changing stream of experiences. And when this clarity begins to settle, life itself softens. You laugh more easily. You let go more gracefully. You suffer less. Not because suffering no longer exists, but because you no longer multiply it with your stories. A passing sadness no longer turns into "my life is meaningless." A minor failure no longer becomes "I'm a failure." A temporary conflict no longer transforms into "they've always hated me." The fog begins to lift, and while it may return, because it will, you'll know it for what it is, a passing mist, not the shape of the world. This is why the journey of awakening is described not as acquiring something new, but as waking up from a dream of permanence, a dream of control, a dream of separateness. And as you wake, you realize that the three poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, have one thing in common. They all depend on you being asleep. When you see them, truly see them, their power weakens. And so our exploration continues. Because if these poisons are the roots of suffering, what grows when you uproot them? What kind of life blossoms in their absence? As the darkness begins to retreat, what kind of light takes its place? We'll find out soon enough. If you look closely, you'll notice something strange about the human condition. We keep chasing what hurts us. We grasp at things we know won't last. We cling to ideas that imprison us. And we react to life in ways that only deepen our pain. It's as if we're caught in a loop, and we don't even realize it. In Buddhist wisdom, this loop has a name. It's called the cycle of suffering, a relentless wheel driven by three powerful forces: greed, hatred, and delusion. The ancients called them the three poisons, and they're not just isolated emotions. They're interconnected. They feed each other. They keep the wheel spinning. And here's how. It often begins with delusion, a misunderstanding, a false perception of how things really are. Maybe you believe that acquiring more will finally make you happy, that certain people are the enemy, that your worth depends on how others see you, or that your thoughts and emotions are facts, not passing clouds. This distorted view becomes the soil in which the other poisons grow. From delusion comes greed, the endless craving. You start grasping for pleasure, possessions, recognition, and security, thinking, if I could just have this or be this, then I'd be at peace. But here's the catch. Life, by its very nature, is impermanent. Everything you cling to will change, decay, or slip through your fingers. And when it does, when you don't get what you want, or when you lose what you thought was yours, what happens? Hatred rises. Sometimes it looks like anger, rage, resentment. Other times it's disappointment, blame, or bitterness turned inward. You resent the world for not obeying your wishes. You resent others for threatening your illusions. You resent yourself for not being enough. And when hatred simmers, it clouds your mind even further. Delusion deepens. You make poor decisions. You cling harder. You react blindly. And just like that, the wheel spins again. Delusion feeds greed. Greed feeds hatred. Hatred feeds more delusion. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, a closed system where suffering multiplies itself. Think about how this plays out in daily life. A person posts a highlight reel of their life online. You see it, compare yourself, and feel lacking. Greed whispers, I want that life, I deserve it. You chase things to fill the emptiness, things you don't need, relationships you can't sustain. When the chase fails, hatred surfaces. You blame the world for being unfair. You envy those who have what you don't. You turn on yourself, convinced you're broken. And through it all, delusion clouds your vision. You never stop to question the game you're playing. You don't see that the peace you seek was never in those external things to begin with. This isn't just a personal issue, it's a collective one. Look at society. Economies built on endless consumption. Politics fueled by division and outrage. Cultures obsessed with image, control, and distraction. It's the three poisons scaled up, playing out on a global stage. And unless interrupted, the cycle tightens. Each turn makes it harder to see the way out, because pain convinces you to cling harder, fear convinces you to fight more, and delusion convinces you that it's all normal. But here's the good news: cycles can be broken. The Buddha didn't just diagnose suffering, he prescribed a way out. And it starts with awareness, because you can't uproot what you refuse to see. When you begin to notice the pattern, to catch yourself in the act, something remarkable happens. You crave something, and instead of chasing it mindlessly, you pause. You feel anger rising, and instead of unleashing it, you observe. You notice a belief surfacing: I'll never be happy unless. And instead of accepting it, you question it. This is how the cycle weakens. Awareness acts like a wedge between impulse and reaction. It creates space. And in that space, you're free. Free to respond rather than react. Free to release rather than cling. Free to see clearly rather than blindly grasp. And over time, as awareness deepens, the poisons lose their grip. Greed gives way to generosity, not just of things, but of heart, of attention, of forgiveness. Hatred dissolves into compassion, not a naive softness, but a fierce, clear kindness that recognizes the pain in others because you've seen it in yourself. Delusion lifts, revealing the simple, direct experience of life as it is, free from the weight of stories and judgments. This isn't theory. It's lived truth, witnessed by millions over centuries. Not in monasteries alone, but in kitchens, offices, cities, and fields. It begins with a single moment of clear seeing, then another, and another. The wheel, once spinning relentlessly, starts to slow. You still experience craving, anger, confusion, but you no longer build your identity around them. They visit and they leave, like waves on the ocean, and the ocean remains. This is the heart of Buddhist practice. Not to escape life, but to wake up within it. To recognize the poisons not as enemies to be destroyed, but as conditions to be understood and released. Because when you stop feeding them, they wither. And what grows in their absence? That's what we're about to uncover. Because if suffering is rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, then what is it rooted in when you live without them? A different kind of life begins to unfold. One not driven by compulsive craving, reactive anger, or blind ignorance, but by qualities the Buddha called the opposites of the poisons: generosity, loving kindness, wisdom. And in the next chapter, we'll step into that light, to see what kind of world you create, not when you perfect yourself, but when you stop poisoning your own heart. Stay with me. We're getting closer. There's a moment, a quiet, almost invisible moment, when you realize you no longer have to live the way you always have, that you don't have to chase every craving, you don't have to cling to every story, you don't have to react to every storm inside you. It's a realization as old as time that the poisons in your heart are not your identity. They are conditions, and what is conditioned can be transformed. In the teachings of the Buddha, suffering isn't a life sentence. It's a teacher, a signal, a doorway. And if you dare to step through, you discover a path, not a perfect, pain-free path, but one that leads to freedom. The ancients called it the middle way, a path that neither indulges craving nor denies life. A path of wisdom, of courage, and of compassion. And it begins with seeing clearly. Mindfulness is the first medicine. It's the art of catching the poisons in real time, not after the damage is done, but as they rise. When craving pulls at your heart, you pause. You don't immediately grab, reach, consume. You notice the ache. You feel its shape. You watch it shift and dissolve like mist in sunlight. When anger flares, you don't become it. You watch it like a wildfire, noticing what it burns, what it feeds on, and how it passes. Not suppressing it, not acting it out, just witnessing. And when confusion clouds your vision, you don't run from it. You sit still inside it. You let the fog settle on its own, because mindfulness isn't passive. It's presence with wisdom. It's the courage to turn toward what hurts rather than away. But mindfulness alone isn't enough. It must be paired with understanding. Insight is what reveals the true nature of things, that all experiences are impermanent, that no emotion, no possession, no identity is solid or lasting, that everything arises based on conditions and falls away when those conditions shift. When you see this directly, craving softens. Because why cling to what you know will pass? Anger weakens. Because why fight a world that was never meant to obey your will? And confusion lifts. Because you start to see life not through stories but through direct experience. Then comes compassion, the natural flowering of a heart no longer poisoned. You begin to see that others, too, are caught in their own cycles. That every harsh word, every selfish act, every reckless mistake comes from suffering, from unmet needs, from unexamined wounds. And instead of reacting with hatred, you respond with care, not indulgence, not naive forgiveness, but a fierce kindness that recognizes the humanity beneath the pain. And here's the secret. The more you offer this compassion outward, the more it heals you inward. Because every time you refuse to feed your own anger, you free yourself a little more. Every time you let go of craving, you reclaim a little peace. And every time you see through a delusion, you come home to reality. It's not about achieving sainthood. It's about remembering your original clarity, the natural wisdom that exists beneath the poisons. And over time, with steady practice, something shifts. Greed transforms into generosity, not just giving things away, but giving presence, giving time, giving forgiveness, giving up the need to always have or win. Hatred transforms into loving kindness, a steady warmth toward yourself and others. Not blind approval, but an understanding that no one is beyond redemption. And delusion dissolves into wisdom, a clear seeing that knows. Life is fleeting, imperfect, and uncontrollable, and that's not a flaw, but its very beauty. This isn't an overnight process. It's a lifetime's work, a path walked step by step, moment by moment. And you'll falter, you'll forget, you'll get pulled under. But each time you remember, each time you return, the poisons loosen their grip, and you get a glimpse of what lies beyond them, a spaciousness, a quiet joy that isn't dependent on getting your way, a peace that survives disappointment, a wisdom that sees the play of life without needing to control its script. This is what the Buddha pointed to when he spoke of nirvana, not a distant paradise, but the extinction of the poisons within. A state where the fire no longer burns because there's nothing left to fuel it. And it's possible for anyone, not through blind faith, not through denial, but through clear seeing, compassionate action, and steady practice. Because every moment you choose awareness over impulse, kindness over hatred, wisdom over delusion, the wheel slows. And one day it stops. And what remains is not emptiness, but the quiet, steady radiance of a mind at peace with itself. So if you felt trapped by craving, if you've burned with anger, if you've wandered in confusion, know this. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were simply asleep. And now, you're beginning to wake up. And in that awakening, a new kind of life begins. One not ruled by poisons, but by presence. And as this path unfolds before you, there's only one thing left to explore. What kind of freedom awaits on the other side of suffering? That's where we'll journey next. And so here we are. After wandering through the shadows of craving, the wildfires of anger, and the fog of delusion, something in you has begun to shift. Maybe it's subtle. A quiet pause where before there was only reaction. A gentle question where once there was certainty. A spark of tenderness where anger used to burn. This is the beginning, not of a new belief system, not of a set of rules to bind you, but of a relationship with your own mind, one built on awareness, honesty, and compassion. You see, the poisons we've spoken of, they don't live out there. They rise within. And that means the cure was never somewhere else. It was never in the perfect partner, the ideal job, the next possession, title, or moment of applause. Freedom isn't about fixing the world. It's about meeting the world with a mind that's no longer enslaved by its poisons. And that kind of freedom is intimate. It's fierce. It's quiet. And it lives in each moment you choose to turn inward rather than outward, to ask not how can I make this go my way, but what is this teaching me about my own clinging, my own fears, my own blindness? Because the deepest truth, the one whispered by sages, carved into ancient scripts, and rediscovered by every person who dares to look, is this. You already possess everything you've been searching for, the peace you crave, the clarity you chase, the belonging you yearn for. They've never been missing. They've only been obscured, hidden behind craving's hunger, anger's heat, and delusion's fog. But beneath them, like a clear sky behind storm clouds, your original nature remains untouched. It doesn't need fixing. It doesn't need improvement. It simply needs uncovering. And the path to uncover it isn't some distant, esoteric ritual. It's here, in your breath, in your body, in your heart's soft ache, in every craving you question, every moment of anger you pause before feeding, every illusion you gently unmask. Little by little, you stop being a prisoner of your own reactions. You become a witness, a participant, a creator of your inner world. And the world outside begins to shift, not because it's changed, but because you have. Relationships soften, grudges loosen, joy sneaks in where you thought only emptiness could live. And while suffering will still visit as it does in every human life, it no longer owns you. It no longer defines you, because you've seen through the lie that peace is somewhere else, that happiness depends on conditions, that you are your anger, your cravings, your confusion. You are not. You are the awareness that witnesses them, the presence that holds them without judgment, the clarity that can dissolve them. This is the heart of the Buddha's teaching, not dogma, not blind faith, but direct experience, and it belongs to you. So if you felt even a flicker of recognition in these words, if some part of you whispers, "Yes, I know this, I remember this," then don't turn away, follow it. Sit with it, feed it with your attention, because that's how it grows, not through force, not through perfection, but through steady, honest returning to yourself, returning to presence, returning to the life that's always been here waiting for you to notice. And that is where true freedom lives, right here, right now, within you. Pause, soft breath. If this journey spoke to you, if these reflections stirred something awake in the quiet corners of your mind, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, your struggles. We're all walking this path together in our own imperfect, beautiful way. And if you believe someone else might need these words, don't hesitate to share this video with them. A single teaching, a single line, can sometimes change the course of a life. Thank you for walking this path with me, for daring to turn inward, for remembering who you are beneath the poisons. Until next time, may you be free, may you be at peace, and may you come home to yourself.